We're up and
There you go. You're ready to go. Sorry.
well, in addition to the intro there, I wanted to expand on my background and how I ended up in the GRC realm. Starting out in the Coast Guard, we did risk assessments and debriefs after every evolution. So it was a very natural transition for me to, as I got into the challenging and dynamic space of cybersecurity, to continue to hone my focus until I found this world of risk management. Just recently completed an engagement that went really well with a healthcare organization here locally, and I was fortunate to surround myself with just the best of the best, some really incredible people that operationalize what we're going to talk about today. So, when I came across the 800 series, doing some casual reading like we all do, right, as practitioners, the 839 really was a eureka moment for me, because I recognized those 4 components. And my goal here today is to simplify what can be considered a very complex function, right? It's really a family of processes that we'll be discussing. Bruce Schneier gets credit for the quote here, complexity is the enemy of security. I also like Exger Dijkstra's simplicity is a prerequisite for reliability, one of those fundamental first principles that I hold dear. So again, we'll talk about some terminology. We'll get into the 4 components of the 839 and some things that I've learned along the way about how to operationalize those components. And then for those that are in the critical infrastructure space, I've got a few slides talking about the statewide risk assessment that I'm supporting right now and why I think that's important to participate in. But just so I can get a lay of the land, pretty small group here. So who's a student right now? Just here to learn and chat. Okay. Who's a practitioner? Okay. And working in critical infrastructure? The 16 sectors. Okay. Appreciate you for being here. Any military, DOD? Okay. Just want to make sure I'm tuning my comments here to the maturity of the room. We'll start again with that basic terminology, just so that we're all on the same page. In order to have a risk, have to have both a viable and active threat, capable threat actor, and an exploitable vulnerability. So in the presence of a threat doesn't mean that we necessarily have a risk. We need to have both in order for there to be a risk. The CVEs that are out there, the National Vulnerability Database, has some 200,000 vulnerabilities listed. Just last year, 25,000 were added. That works out to almost 70 a day, but less than 10% of those are actually exploitable. The exact number is, I'm not going to quote anything that I've seen. I don't know that it's a changing number, but it's a very small percentage of these vulnerabilities, even critical vulnerabilities. These vulnerability scanners are highlighting, are even exploitable. So again, exploitable, risk does not exist. And this is important as we talk about risk management, because we don't do security because it's fun and business leaders like to invest in security. We do it because there are risks that the organization has found unacceptable that have to be addressed. So determining the likelihood and impact of those risks is something that we'll talk about a little later as we talk about assessments and how to respond to them. But why we do risk management, just like we talked about why we do cybersecurity, is to manage risks. Why we do risk management is because our resources are limited. If we had unlimited resources, unlimited expertise, unlimited budget, we would just do security. So we take it to the nth degree and there would be no business interruption and everything would be automated and running perfectly well, right? Because we just have armies and armies of people working on this that had all the training and resources they need, but that's not the reality for anybody. Organizations are operating in very highly complex and interconnected environments, and these things are changing. So leaders have to recognize they have to make explicit, well-informed, and risk-based decisions in order to balance the benefits gained from the operation that they're considering with the risks that one of those vulnerabilities will be exploited, causing harm to the assets or people or operations that they are trying to move forward on. So that balancing act for decision makers is constantly what they're weighing, and it has to be explicit. It has to be understood in order to be a good decision. So those key questions that we're going to talk about here and why I think the 839 of those 4 components is such a great model of how much risk is accepted. Where is that line between acceptable and unacceptable, the risk tolerance? What response is reasonable, right? Our response has to be reasonable, but what does that mean? If it's unreasonable, then it's considered negligent. No leader wants to be found negligent for not doing what would later be considered reasonable. So we'll talk a little bit about what that means. And then that key challenge that I want to talk about and highlight is how we measure and communicate risk to those leaders. Who's responsible for doing this? The answer is everybody. All levels of the organization. NIST prescribes a 3-level approach, which I found very useful. At the organizational level, the strategic leaders making those long-term decisions. At the second level, you've got the mission and business process level, those division heads and department heads, mid-level managers of the organization. And then finally, at the system level, the bottom of the pyramid, you've got your hands-on folks doing the administration and management of those different systems, applications that the business relies on to operate. And again, this is a multi-faceted family of processes that require the involvement of the entire organization. And what the NIST describes here in their flagship publication, they call it 839 for managing information security risk. This was the eureka moment for me coming from the military. I recognized the OODA loop in it. Is anybody familiar with Boyd's OODA loop from the Air Force? All right, observe, orient, decide, act. When you're in the cockpit of a fighter plane in a dogfight, you are constantly observing, orienting, deciding, and acting. And that's something that they coined in the Air Force to respond to a very dynamic situation like a dogfight. And it structured their thinking and their approach in the cockpit so that they can make good decisions and react to new information as it came in. So I see this starting with the framing, which we'll talk about, of course, the assessment, the response, and the monitoring of that risk. That's our OODA loop in cybersecurity, right? That's the family of processes that we apply in a structured and rigorous way in order to make consistent decisions about how to treat our risk across the organization. So pause here. Really want to sear this image into your brains. I love this picture. And again, it's straight from that flagship publication. So this is not according to Dan Holland. This is according to NIST's special pub for managing information security risks. So we'll break this down here in the coming slides. The first component, the risk framing. This is the key part that so many organizations skip as they start an assessment. They don't put that foundation in place, which defines those guardrails that the organization is supposed to operate within. We call this the risk frame. It produces a risk management strategy and addresses some very critical things that define the terminology and includes the expression of security and privacy risk tolerance, which we'll talk about a little bit more. The risk mitigation strategies, how the risk is going to be addressed from a mitigation standpoint. The risk assessment methodologies and what the criteria are to define those terms. What does a critical mean? What does a high mean? How are we going to treat this? And ultimately, how the approaches to monitoring risk over time are going to be addressed. So this risk management strategy lays the foundation for and addresses governance and compliance, right? Our assumptions, our constraints. It's a comprehensive document, but it is foundational to doing governance, risk management, and compliance, to making informed decisions about how we treat cyber risk. I like to use a car analogy here, and I apologize, you probably heard more than one car analogy today, but I can't help myself. The risk appetite and risk tolerance are such key terms to understand and to define clearly. And there's a lot of organizations that have either used broad or unspecific language, or not even bothered to try to document this at all because their leadership doesn't want to sign the dotted line saying this is what is acceptable to me, this is what is unacceptable to me, because it hasn't been communicated to them in terms that they understand. So if we're cruising down the road and it's a 70-mile-an-hour zone on the freeway here, like most of the Florida freeways are, the 70-mile-an-hour limit is there for a reason. It is what the government has deemed reasonable for driving on that road, right? However, I think all of us have driven on a freeway before, and 70 miles an hour is not the typical flow of traffic, especially in that left lane, right? So there's some room between that understood and explicit line of speed that is tolerable for or the appetite of the government with the tolerance of those police officers who are going to make a decision about whether or not to they're going to pull you over for going 80, 85, 90, right? Circumstantial, right? Because in the rain, that police officer might pull you over for going 75 if you're driving recklessly and they see some things that they don't like. They've got that ability to respond to information and to change their risk tolerance based on the circumstance. However, sunny day, little traffic, 10, 15 miles an hour over the speed limit. I've not seen too many people get pulled over in those circumstances. So clearly the risk tolerance is up to the individual discretion of that officer. And our mission here is to codify that and communicate it across the organization so that folks understand where that line of risk tolerance is, because beyond that point is unacceptable to my leaders. Therefore, we have to do something about it, right? We can't accept unacceptable risk from our board of directors. And taking that off the plate, off the table, is really that first key step to being able to effectively respond and manage these risks. So the key questions, I think, to determine the risk tolerance: is compliance viewed as the goal or the bare minimum standard? Because compliance could be where you draw your risk tolerance line and say anything beyond anything that is non-compliant is unacceptable to us. For certain critical systems, I don't think that compliance is optional, but we sure treat it that way in this space, right? In the government, which certain, our regulators would argue that compliance isn't optional, but we exist in a world of risk waivers and exceptions of non-compliance, and that's just a reality that we all face because business operations dictate that we need to perform certain things, and if controls aren't in place, then so be it. We'll have a plan to address them, but maybe not, right? It all depends on the maturity of the organization that we're working for. How might risk tolerance differ across different departments based on the mission, the nature and classification of the data investment? What are they trying to accomplish? They can have it can be a very low risk tolerance circumstance around highly regulated information and systems. OT networks, if you're an electrical grid company, PHI data, if you're a healthcare organization, you want to have a stricter set of controls around those sensitive and critical systems than around non-critical systems because it's inefficient, right? But risk management gives us the structure to approach and address those issues. So cannot overstate the importance of clearly determining and expressing risk tolerance and having the senior leadership of the organization document that so that the rest of the organization can respond accordingly, knowing where the left and right boundaries are that we're operating within. So fundamental, so important, and missing at a large majority of organizations that I speak with. Before I move on, examples of maybe ineffective and effective. What does this mean? What does this look like? I can give some examples. I think that vague terms like severe, critical, substantial don't do us any favors, because we can say we're not going to accept risks that are deemed to have a potentially severe impact on our operations, but it's something different to everybody in this room, right? So again, that risk management strategy that we get in the framing should define those terms, but too often is missing. So we need to talk about how we are going to measure and respond to risk via the risk assessment, which is that second component that we're going to talk about next. I'll save my thoughts on risk quantification versus qualitative here in a little bit. For that second component, like I was mentioning, after we've got that foundation, that frame in place, then we are conducting an assessment. There are many forms and methods to conduct a risk assessment, right? Again, there are penetration tests, the ethical hacking. There are vulnerability assessments, those constant scanners that are highlighting and searching for those known vulnerabilities. There are qualitative assessments against certain frameworks. The NIST cybersecurity framework is a very common one for our critical infrastructure. The quantitative assessments, right, where we translate this into business terms that the financial and non-technical audience are more comfortable responding to and making investment decisions against. All of these are methods of assessment that are determined in the risk frame in that strategy, and we're going to say this is how we're going to assess. This is the frequency, and then here we are conducting the assessment. This is where we identify, determine, disseminate, and update continuous monitoring, right? Those threats vulnerabilities, the impact, and likelihood of these occurrences. So they can conduct these risk assessments at all levels of the organization, right? That pyramid, back to it. We conduct assessments at the organization level, at the business process level. Those system level assessments are key and often skipped over because people say, oh, we did an annual assessment at the organization and we surveyed across the departments, but really getting into that application specific assessment and helping define controls for that use case is key. This has to be done at the different levels of the organization and communicating the risks up the chain and informing those investment decisions that they're trying to make. We've all seen these matrices, right? These heat maps, the 1 through 5s, the red, yellow, greens. The risk equals probability times impact is how we communicate through risk assessment, the severity of the risk. So, you know, some of these images are self-explanatory, but everybody's familiar with this, right? We've all seen risk communicated and reported this way. It makes us in cybersecurity kind of feel like this. When we're taking these matrices to the board and expecting them to be able to respond and understand what we're talking about. It's not fair to them because the key problem that we are trying to address is inherently complex and difficult to understand. So I don't believe that this is sufficient. I think that we can do better, and it is on us as security practitioners to do better in how we communicate risks. Assessments are not an exact science, right? It can't be. Douglas Hubbard is one of the fathers of risk quantification, the author of How to Measure Anything in Cybersecurity Risk, and he defined measurement as a reduction of uncertainty based on one or more observations, right? And if we can express that quantitatively, it translates it into a universal language. What a severe and expected risk in the top right corner means to or the analyst that is making that subjective assessment is going to be different than another analyst with a different set of experiences and backgrounds, right? So it's very hard to use these ordinal values and communicate consistently because we have different analysts, different perspectives, different criteria. You don't want to go full risk quantification. You know, there are other methods to measure severity. One that I've used and like is dread scoring. Damage, reproducibility, and a few others, exploitability. It's to identify, you know, you assign a 0 to 10 score for each of those 5 components. And then you can say, okay, a critical finding to our organization is a threat score of 40 to 50. And a high is 30 to 40. At least you've got some structure and some defensibility in how you assess that risk and rated the severity of it. The art of the possible. I'm showing this because it is possible and we can model risk quantitatively and do some really interesting things like overlay the insurance limit to the impact class it's expected to pay to show what the uncovered risk would be for a certain scenario. So again, taking that threat-based approach and modeling what the first and third party financial and tangible risks would be, what the possible financial outcomes would be, and expressing that on a loss exceedance curve, I think is the superior way to communicate to executive leaders about the risks that they're facing, because now they can calculate a return on risk mitigation. So that's the key. It's like return on investment. If we have $200,000 of uncovered exposure because of a ransomware scenario based on these assumptions, very transparently, and the CISO is asking for $10,000 to mitigate that risk, and the residual risk that we model after this $10,000 control is $50,000, then you can do that $150,000 of risk mitigation, the $10,000 investment math, right? A CFO understands that. Boards of directors understand that it's on us to translate the severity of what we are up against and what we want to do about it into terms that they can respond to. So back to the risk framing. I think that the superior way, the best in class way to express risk tolerance is quantitatively. For these systems that are critical to our operation, we are not going to tolerate risks that expose us to more than $10 million, $100 million of risk. It's going to be very circumstantial as intended. You know, the one thing about this that often is brought up is can't quantify loss of life, right? If we are now in critical infrastructure, seeing real life scenarios where folks are dying because of the result of cyber attacks. Awful. These stories up in Georgia at a hospital where a life-saving system that a baby was hooked up to, was taken offline by an attack and the child lost their life. So we can't quantify that, right? What we can quantify is reputational damage and the impact. What downtime is, forensics, the impact of all of these individual components that add up to a certain model of risk. So again, I think that that quant is the future, the way to go, and it's incumbent upon us as practitioners to do the extra analysis when we are conducting our assessments and communicate in terms that they can reliably and consistently respond to. That third component, right? This is where we are left with clarity. We've got our risk frame. We understand what the guardrails are. We understand the risks and whether or not they are acceptable to the organization. And now I've got to make a decision based on understanding. And we're only left with 4 decision pathways when faced with a risk. We can accept it, we can avoid it, we can transfer it, or we can mitigate it. The mitigation is where we're doing cybersecurity, right? This is all cybersecurity, but cybersecurity operations, that first line of defense, if I can reference the Institute of Internal Auditors 3 lines of defense model, GRC really exists in that second line of defense, where we are helping the first line prioritize their actions and activities because resources are limited, and those different perspectives, those different functions support each other very seamlessly when implemented in a thoughtful way. That third line of defense would be internal audit for that model. So definitely recommend from an organizational structure standpoint, thinking of it in those terms. Fourth line of defense is where operations exist, IT and security. That's where the work is being done to administer and apply these controls. Second line of defense is informing the risks and the prioritization of those. So, this is people that skip to this part, and the vendors outside, that make the tools would love for you just to skip to this part because they've got the answers to everything, right? Their multi-factor authentication, their SIM, their EDR, MDR services. All of that is going to solve all your problems, but we all know that that's not the case because it depends which threat we're talking about. What's more important, authentication or logging? Is a question I like to pose to folks, and they say, well, they got opinions about one or the other, but the truth is it depends. If we're talking about an insider threat scenario, the authentication controls aren't doing much for us because presuming those folks have access and the authorization to get to the sensitive data that they are a threat to. So in that case, the logging control would clearly be the one to prioritize that will have impact on risk mitigation. So again, a consistent organization-wide response according to the risk frame is what we're striving for here. And the fourth and final component is that continuous monitoring. So there's, for all 4 of these components, there are 800 series publications that I recommend you get into. Risk assessments 830 or 800-154 for data-centric threat modeling. Here it's for continuous monitoring, it's 800-137, and this describes a 6-step process that really maps to the 4 components that we're talking about, but this is at the system level where we're continuously moving through space and time as circumstances change. Tripwires that require additional assessment, either time-based or event-based. If a new leader comes into the organization, it doesn't just have to be a technical change in configuration, but say a new leader comes into the organization that has a different risk tolerance than their predecessor. Well, now we need to go in and conduct additional assessment to make sure that we are still within the bounds of what is considered acceptable according to our risk frame. So that's the adaptability here and the continuous nature of what we mean when we say continuous monitoring. That term is going to mean different things to different systems and different organizations, but the key is that frequency is sufficient to support the risk-based decisions that the organization is trying to make. So taking a step back and saying, okay, what is appropriate here? At what frequency do we need to do this? At what frequency is reasonable? How do we need to treat this in an ongoing manner? What are those bounds? That's what we're aiming for here again with the broad-based approach to risk management, again, based on these very simple 4 steps that each are a family of processes unto themselves and done by dedicated and committed experts to these functions. Third-party risk, fourth-party risk. is also a key part of this. We're not just talking about the systems that we have in production. The open systems theory of organizations is what I prescribe to. We are permeable, right? And information and systems are interconnected, not just within our walls, which are virtual now and to varying degrees, but also reliant on those third-party and fourth-party systems. This all kind of comes back to GitHub, right? In the open source community in a lot of ways. This is, again, not an exact science, but a function that is absolutely critical for organizations to commit substantial resources to performing in an ongoing basis. So the key takeaways, before I get to the Cyber Florida slides and ask about that assessment, is we need dedicated experts to do this and to do it continuously at that frequency that's been determined. Because our resources are limited and they have to be prioritized. We can't just go with our gut on this stuff. As smart as many of us are, as the organization scales and matures, the leaders need that decision-making framework and process to do it consistently over time. Governance and compliance framing, that first component that is so key, it reflects our mission, those internal and external requirements, regulatory, statutory, contractual, but also the culture. Different leaders. This is a human problem. This is not something that we can just look to the 800 series and copy paste between different organizations, because it reflects the human element, the culture and the tolerance of those leaders in their pursuit of digital innovation and transforming the way they do business, weighing those things against the risks that they introduce, because every one of them expands our attack surface and makes us more vulnerable, but we continue to do it, right? So it must be worth it, right? I mean, we're doing it. So we've got to understand what is reasonable, what's required of us, and respond accordingly. That really covers that third piece about the boards and the leaders determining and clearly expressing that risk tolerance. And then finally, how we measure and communicate risk has to be consistent across the analyst team that's doing the assessments. They have to have that structure, and it has to be communicated in the language of the risk owner, because the CISO doesn't own risk at these organizations. They can't. They're a risk advisor. Now, that's the role of a CISO. CISO's in the room. I mean, am I wrong? You don't own risk, do you? It's something that requires a culture shift in education, because they look to the CISO to own the risk. They want the CISO to own the risk. Again, liability and accountability and whatnot, but that's just not the job. So it requires, in order to get them to assume that responsibility and to make informed decisions, we have to take it upon ourselves to communicate in terms that they understand. Moving on, for the critical infrastructure, the state of Florida is conducting a statewide risk assessment on the governor's order to gain an understanding of what the risk profile is for the different sectors of critical infrastructure across the state. It's the first time this is being done, and it is incumbent upon all of us, to participate. So I'd love to share just a little bit of information about this. If you are unclear, if you are operating in critical infrastructure, here are the 16 sectors according to what CISA and CISA, what they put out, and based on White House guidance. So the state of Florida legislature has hired Cyber Florida to conduct this assessment, and they've got until June 30th to complete the report, working with MITRE, FDME, Emergency Management, the Idaho National Labs, regional consultants like myself, to engage with the critical infrastructure folks and put their minds at ease about the confidentiality, security of their responses, and what this is going to be for. The state of Florida just yesterday closed the grant period for $30 million to respond to risk. So references back to the 839. Did they do that in the right order? Right in the middle of an assessment period, we're going to release and close the grants period to respond to it, right? We'll get it right next year, though. It's a work in progress, but Cyber Florida, if you're not familiar, is hosted right here at USF. It's a tremendous nonprofit organization led by General Frank McKenzie, who just retired, a 4-star running CENTCOM Marine, and he's running the show. And they're moving on a lot of fronts. So a lot of funding flowing from Tallahassee into Cyber Florida to perform a variety of functions for local governments, critical infrastructure, and other stakeholders. I work very closely with them in my nonprofit realm on the K-12 front. We're hosting 400 students next week and on the 12th, and the White House is coming down for it. So a lot of momentum, a lot of productivity in this K-12 space in the work and continuing education workforce development. So Cyber Florida is doing tremendous work, and this assessment is so the NIST cybersecurity framework is the framework of choice, and it has been paired with the ransomware readiness assessment, bringing the total number of questions to about 150 for this assessment. But it is a self-assessment, and they decided not to use a maturity model for this first year, so it's just yes, no, or NA. It is not a super heavy lift, especially if you already have that baseline to perform. But it is a valuable set of reporting that you get at the end out of that free CSET tool, which this is Cyber Florida's instance of the CSET tool. The CSET tool is what CISA uses when they come out and conduct assessments, usually for local government agencies, but it's a familiar tool for folks that work in that state and local government space, and one that is securely supported here by USF and their IT team is where your responses will be housed, and I can share more information about that if you're interested in learning about the confidentiality and purposes of this. But the call to action for it is to complete the assessment, right? To get the legal support to get this into your workflows, and please address it because the governor and the legislature are investing quite a bit in cybersecurity, and we need to keep them informed. They need to understand what your operational realities are in critical infrastructure. So this is our avenue to communicate so that they can establish that risk frame, respond to the risks, and continue to monitor them on an ongoing basis. So this is the state's attempt to put that OODA loop into practice across the sectors that we all rely on as Floridians. If the grid goes down, if our hospitals are offline, that impacts us very deeply and very personally. So with that, I'd love to open it up to any questions or comments, and we can talk about the four components of the 839. We can talk about the Cyber Florida risk assessment or whatever else is on your mind.
Space between this and why have we coordinated with the other states to what you said.
Okay, so on the assessment, why is the state doing this at the state level? There are national level assessments that, so the MSISAC that rolls up into the Center for Internet Security, CIS, has been for 16 years conducting a nationwide assessment of those local government agencies, which they route to the Senate Appropriations Committee, which unlocks the federal funding. This is the state's level or attempt to essentially duplicate that effort, that program at the state level. So state level funding for the state level assessment, federal level funding for the national assessment.
I work for USF. We're supporting this effort. This is the first kind of its effort in the state. Florida is trying to be a leader for the other states to follow. And so that's why they're doing it here. There doesn't seem to be this kind of effort that we know about.
Maybe this is a question for you. As a department of USF, if we were to sell CSET assessment, who would we send it to?
I think if you do their CSET assessment, it goes to Cyber Florida because they have a specific set of questions that are much easier. The CSET itself is very comprehensive. I'm sorry, I don't mean to take over your time.
I'm starting to get a little hoarse, so.
CSET itself is extensive and has a lot of different frameworks to choose from and questions. It's way more than 150 questions. So this is very specific for this effort.
So would you or someone in Cyber Florida be the contact for us as a department to connect?
I think it's Cyber Florida.
Yeah, so, and that's they've retained me to support this. So I'll give you my card and be happy to answer any questions you have.
So what about like risk mitigation strategies such as, there's like culture paradigms, right? But like shift left, right? That's something that's been kind of tossed around where, you're moving risk management responsibilities out from CISOs and leaders to maybe more tactical, business owners and directors, VPs, such and such. Is there any efforts kind of within your experience, whether it's within the Cyber Florida or just in general for other clients, to where you're finding another change in the culture dynamic of how you execute or how you're communicating risk at maybe a middle tier as opposed to, board level and C-level executives? Are you finding like more adoption strategies with that?
Absolutely. The beautiful thing about this is it applies to any step of the software development lifecycle, as well as it embeds with enterprise architecture and informs how those systems are modularized and built together. What's that operating model look like? So absolutely, the further left we push this, the deeper we embed our partnership with those other departments and engage in operations, the better we can communicate things into their terminology, right? Across different departments. So,
but at large, you are seeing kind of more of a gravitational pull towards that.
Absolutely. The CISOs have been maturing. They know their stuff now, and they're business leaders first, technology leaders second. Seeing that shift more and more. So, describing trends here, but also, that bedrock approach, that OODA loop of continuous monitoring is something that I'm seeing adopted quite frequently. But the immature organizations that are just starting out that have a 3-person shop, I talked to a fair number of those as well. Okay, I know I don't need to conduct an assessment. I know I need firewalls, right? Okay, good firewalls. I'm not saying do this, put this structure in place if you are not there yet, because at the end of the day, policies don't actually mitigate risk, right? They have to be implemented. You have to have somebody responsible for implementing them. If you're just trying to keep your head above water, deploy that antivirus tool on your endpoints, hire an MSSP to monitor your network. Those core fundamentally multi-factor authentication, there's a bunch of core controls that are universal and you don't need to think too hard about. But when it gets beyond that point, then this structure, I think, is the right order. And that's just my opinion. I think, invest if, resources are limited, invest in those things that are common sense that you have to do to bring the risk down to reasonable, what you think is reasonable. And this will help tune it. And what's that go forward look like as the organization scales and starts adopting an enterprise mentality?
What kind of shifts are you seeing as more companies adopt cloud in the whole governance role?
Sure. Again, specific lawyers. I'm seeing a lot more lawyer fees, right? Reviewing the contract. Specificity in the contractual language about the shared responsibility is key, right? Those contracts have to be explicit, and it has to be within the risk frame of the organization. So, and cloud's tough. There's a lot of automation that we can do, though, from a GRC standpoint with cloud systems, automating the evidence collection piece, integrations with GRC platforms into these cloud systems allows us to get that real-time visibility, because these cloud providers will patch systems and change configurations that were compliant and were secure. And now we went back to a default configuration, and well, now what was compliant and secure within our risk frame of tolerance yesterday is now not, through no action that we took directly. So having that real-time visibility, those integrations is key as organizations mature to get that automated functionality, but also that real-time visibility to those changes.
From your assessment, what's the maturity level of corporations being able to have an effective governance model?
It's all over the place. I think that national cybersecurity strategy was more political posturing than specificity, but their implementation strategy is coming out here shortly. I expect that, and I hope that we reduce the bureaucracy that's responsible for regulating critical infrastructure, but I'm not holding my breath on that. I expect that we will continue to, leaders will continue to do what is mandated of them and not a thing more. But as those SEC changes come into effect, boards of directors are required to have cyber expertise. I think that this is trending in the right direction. It's just taking longer than we would like, because we understand, back to that nuclear bomb picture, with the aliens, what the risks are. We understand that, again, on us to translate it, but the requirements to put the structure in place are present and growing.
Do you have any
feel for it. There's the Florida legislature passed into law a requirement for local government organizations within Florida to align with a cybersecurity framework. Are you seeing actual progress toward that in these assessments?
It depends, you know. Conducting this assessment, this is our baseline. You know, we want to make progress against this at the local government level, but the MSI SAC has 16 years of data that they've been compiling. They do use a maturity model, and their report is very helpful to see those trends across all states and geography, geography. Generally, though, there's been a lot of grant money flowing to those local government organizations. States are, and the federal government are rolling out direct operational support. They're saying, hey, hire us to be your SOC onto your network. It's a little big brother for my taste, but it's an option. So there are more and more of those services that are available to our critical infrastructure, and especially those SLTT, state, local, territorial, and tribal organizations.
Time, any other questions?
Really appreciate the dialogue. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Yeah. Talk as fast as